Once upon a time, in a bustling city filled with towering buildings and endless noise, there lived a woman named Nazo. She was a woman of quiet strength, her hands calloused from years of labor, her heart heavy with the weight of unspoken sacrifices. Nazo worked tirelessly as a toilet cleaner in one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Every day, she scrubbed floors, wiped away filth, and endured the disdainful glances of those who passed her by. But she bore it all without complaint, for she had a single purpose in life to provide for her only daughter, Heir. Heir, however, was not the grateful child Nazo had hoped for. She was stubborn, selfish, and consumed by a burning desire for wealth and status. From a young age, Heir had resented her mother for their poverty. She despised the small, cramped house they lived in, the second-hand clothes she wore, and the simple meals they shared. To Heir, her mother's sacrifices were not acts of love, but reminders of her own inadequacy. She longed for the life her wealthy friends enjoyed, luxurious vacations, designer clothes, and the latest gadgets. And she blamed her mother for not being able to provide these things. "You smell of filth." Air would sneer whenever Nazo returned home from work, her voice dripping with contempt. "How can you even call yourself a mother? You're nothing but a poor toilet cleaner. You have no vision, no ambition. You're cursed." Nazo's heart ached every time her daughter hurled these cruel words at her. She had given up so much, her youth, her dreams, her dignity, to ensure that Air had a roof over her head, food on the table, and an education. But Air was blind to her mother's struggles. All she saw was the poverty that surrounded them, and she hated it. One evening, after yet another bitter argument, Air made a decision. She could no longer live in this suffocating environment. She could no longer bear the shame of being the daughter of a toilet cleaner. She packed her bags, determined to leave behind the life she despised. Before she left, she wrote a letter to her mother, pouring out all her anger and resentment. "Dear Mother," the letter began, "I can no longer live like this. I am tired of your poverty, your sacrifices, your endless excuses. You are a curse to me, and I refuse to let your lack of ambition ruin my life. I am leaving to live with my father, the man you always painted as a devil. But I know better. He is wealthy, successful, and he will give me the life I deserve. Goodbye, and don't come looking for me." With that, Air walked out of the small house, her heart filled with a mix of excitement and relief. She was finally free, free from the smell of cleaning products, free from the shame of poverty, free from her mother's suffocating love. Meanwhile, Nazo returned home to find the letter. Her hands trembled as she read the words, each one cutting deeper than the last. Tears streamed down her face as she realized that her daughter, the child she had loved and sacrificed for, had abandoned her. She thought of all the sleepless nights she had spent worrying about Ira's future, all the time she had gone hungry so her daughter could eat, all the dreams she had buried so Ira could have a chance at a better life. And now, it had all been for nothing. Nazo's heart shattered as she sat in the small, empty house, the silence echoing her pain. She thought of her ex-husband, Chief Afam, the man who had abandoned them both on the day Heir was born. He had never cared for them, never sent a penny to help, never even bothered to check on his daughter. And now, Heir had chosen him over her. The betrayal was too much to bear. But despite the pain, Nazo's love for her daughter remained unwavering. A mother's love is unconditional, after all. After days of heartbreak, she decided to go in search of Heir. She couldn't let her daughter throw her life away for a man who had never cared for her. When Nazo arrived at the grand gates of Chief Afam's mansion, she was met with harsh stares from the guards. The house was enormous, a symbol of wealth and power far beyond anything Nazo had ever known. She hesitated for a moment, her faded dress and worn-out shoes a stark contrast to the opulence before her. But she gathered her courage and stepped forward. I'm here to see my daughter, Elle, she said firmly, her voice trembling but resolute. The guards exchanged skeptical glances, but before they could turn her away, Elle herself appeared at the door. She was dressed in expensive clothes, her face glowing with the confidence of someone who had finally achieved the life she had always wanted. But when she saw her mother, her expression twisted into one of disgust. What are you doing here? Air snapped, her voice cold and cutting. Have you come to beg for money? Or perhaps you've realized how pathetic your life is and want to drag me down with you. Nazo's lips trembled as she tried to speak. Air, my child, I only came to remind you of where you belong. You are my daughter, not this man's property. Please come home. Air scoffed, her eyes filled with contempt. Home? To what? A house that smells of toilets. A life of suffering. No, thank you. I refuse to let your curse follow me. If you're not allergic to poverty, I am, and I refuse to be a part of it. With that, Air turned to the guards and ordered them to throw her mother out. Nazo stood there, frozen, as the guards roughly grabbed her and dragged her away from the mansion. She stumbled onto the paved road, her heart breaking as she watched her daughter, her own flesh and blood, turn her back on her completely. The weeks that followed were a blur for Nazo. She returned to her small house, her heart heavy with grief. Meanwhile, Air continued to enjoy the luxurious life she had always dreamed of. She flaunted her wealth on social media, surrounded herself with new friends, and basked in the attention her father's money brought her. But deep down, something felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that her new life was built on shaky ground. One evening, Chief Afam informed Air that she would be accompanying him to a meeting. He handed her a black dress and urged her to get ready. Air was excited. This was her chance to prove to her father that she belonged in his world. She dressed in the black dress, applied light makeup, and followed him out of the mansion. But as they drove farther away from the city, Air's excitement turned to unease. The smooth roads gave way to rough paths, and the city lights disappeared, replaced by the darkness of a dense forest. The car finally stopped in front of an old, isolated house. Air hesitated, her heart pounding as she stepped out of the car. Daddy, where exactly are we going? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Chief of Fam didn't answer. He simply walked ahead, commanding her to follow. Reluctantly, Air obeyed. The moment she stepped into the house, a strange dizziness washed over her. Her vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin. She stumbled, gripping the arm of a chair to steady herself. What's happening to me? She asked, her voice weak. But her father stood there, watching as she collapsed into the chair. The last thing she saw was his cold, unfeeling eyes before everything went black. When Air woke up, she was back in her bed in her father's mansion. She tried to convince herself that it had all been a dream, but something felt different. She began to have recurring nightmares, each one more terrifying than the last. In her dreams, she found herself digging in a dark forest, her hands covered in dirt, her body aching with exhaustion. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop digging. As the days passed, Air's condition worsened. She woke up every morning in pain, her body sore and weak. A strange swelling appeared on her wrist, and the skin around it began to darken and rot. A foul smell followed her everywhere, no matter how much she tried to cover it up. Her so-called friends abandoned her, and even her father grew disgusted by her condition. One morning, Chief of Fam summoned her to the living room. You can no longer stay here, he said coldly. The smell is unbearable. I will not have my home turned into a graveyard. Air's heart sank as she realized that her father was throwing her out. She begged and pleaded, but he showed no remorse. You are cursed, he said, his voice filled with disdain. I can't allow you to destroy everything I've built. With that, Air was dragged out of the mansion and left to fend for herself. She wandered the streets, her body decaying, her spirit broken. She had no one to turn to, nowhere to go. Finally, she found herself standing outside her mother's small house, her heart filled with regret. But when she knocked on the door, a young man answered. Nazo no longer lives here, he said. Air's heart shattered. Her mother was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. She collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. She had traded gold for rocks, and now she had nothing. As she wandered the streets, Air's condition continued to worsen. The smell of decay clung to her, and people avoided her like the plague. She became a shadow of her former self, a living reminder of the consequences of her greed and ingratitude. One day, as she stood by a river, contemplating ending her life, she encountered a blind, legless woman covered in sores. The woman's cries pierced Ear's heart, and for the first time, she realized that her suffering was not the end. Life, no matter how painful, was still a gift. In that moment, Ear made a decision. She would not give up. She would find her mother and beg for forgiveness. She would make amends for the mistakes she had made. But as she turned to leave, she suddenly woke up in her mother's house. It had all been a dream, a vivid, terrifying warning. Air looked around, her heart pounding as she realized the truth. She had never left her mother. She had never gone to her father's house. Everything she had experienced, the wealth, the betrayal, the sickness, had been a vision of what could have been. Tears filled Air's eyes as she stumbled out of her room and into the small living space. Her mother, Nazo, stood there, her face filled with concern. You were tossing and turning all night, Nazo said gently. Are you all right, my child? Air fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Mama, I was blind. I was ungrateful. I cursed you when all you ever did was love me. I called you cursed, but I was the one who was cursed. I abandoned you in my heart, Mama. I wanted to chase after wealth, and in my dream, I lost you in the process. Nazo's eyes filled with tears as she pulled her daughter into her arms. Oh, my child, she whispered. You didn't lose me. You have always been mine. I have loved you from the moment I carried you in my womb, and I will love you until my last breath. Air wept, holding onto her mother as if afraid she would disappear. That day, she made a silent vow. She would never again take her mother's love for granted. She would never again be blinded by the illusion of wealth. She would cherish her mother forever, knowing that her mother's love was the greatest blessing she had ever received. And so, Erin learned to appreciate the sacrifices her mother had made for her. She realized that true wealth was not measured in money or status, but in the love and bonds we share with those who genuinely care for us. The lesson was clear. Cherish the people in your life, for you never know their value until they're gone.